Hi class, in this video we are starting with a discussion of the two major routes of persuasion that Petty and Cacioppo created. So you have the central route and then you have the peripheral route. The central route involves weighing arguments, considering relevant facts, thinking about issues in a systematic fashion, and then you come to the decision on whether you're going to be persuaded, what your opinion or your attitude is going to be. Whereas with the peripheral route, you respond to a simple, often irrelevant cue that suggests the rightness, wrongness, or attractiveness of an argument without giving it much thought. As compared to the central route, this is less direct. It tends to, so some examples, a couple before your time. For the O.J. Simpson trial, which was definitely before you were born, a big part of O.J. getting acquitted of murdering his ex-wife and her friend was that there was a bloody leather glove that was found at the scene. And so they made him try the glove on during the trial, and he was like struggling to get it over his hand. And so his lawyers had this phrase, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And they said this over and over again throughout the trial. And so it did not matter all of the facts they had that seemed to show that he is the one that committed the crime. In the jurors' minds, a big part afterwards when they interviewed the jurors, why did you acquit him? A lot of them mentioned this phrase, this jingle. Jingles are peripheral route of processing. For example, McGlone did an experiment where college students were given aphorisms, basically, sayings that they didn't know, they hadn't heard before. And some of them rhymed, like woes unite foes. And some of them didn't rhyme, like woes unite enemies. Technically, both of those aphorisms mean the same thing. Woes unite foes, woes unite enemies. But if it was one that rhymed, like woes unite foes, the participants were significantly more likely to believe it, to think it was actually true. And so because in the O.J. trial, it was this, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit, it's this rhyming aphorism, the jurors were more likely to believe it, to think it was true. Oh, look, he struggled. We have to acquit him regardless of the other facts. Other examples of, so in general, using language, if the way you phrase something affects what you are going to believe, that's peripheral route. It's not the facts, it's the language, it's how it sounds. And so examples of this, when the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, or Obamacare, was getting passed back in, oh gosh, so this was 2009? 2009 range? Yes. 2009, 2010. Before 2010. So, a while ago. There was, one of the reasons it was called Obamacare by a lot of people was because Republican lawmakers called it that because they thought Republicans wouldn't like Obama, and so it would make them hate this healthcare legislation if it was called Obamacare. And so it was Republicans who used Obamacare as a phrase, not Democrats. Democrats always called it ACA. And so if you polled people to say, what do you think about Obamacare? Or what do you think about the ACA? The majority of Republicans were against Obamacare. It shouldn't be passed. We shouldn't have it. It's horrible. If you asked them about the ACA and like exactly what's actually in it, the majority of people liked it. It was just the language that was being used, using the language of Obamacare to make sure Republican voters didn't like it is a peripheral route. Like, don't focus on the facts, the central route, what's actually in the bill. Just focus on this name. You don't like Obama, call it Obamacare. Or if you see this in the abortion debate, calling it pro-life or pro-choice, or are you anti-abortion or are you pro-forced birth? The phrasing that the different sides in that debate use is very intentional, and it's to get at that peripheral route of processing, to get people to have sort of a feeling and not focus as much on the facts. So if your aim is to persuade, you need to know how important the issue is. If you're deciding whether or not you are going to use the central or the peripheral route, you have to know how important it is. You have to know how well informed they are. If they are really knowledgeable, and if this is an important issue for them, then you have to have a strong logical argument. You need to use the central route in your persuasive appeal. But if it's something they don't really care about, or if they don't really understand the issue, then you need to use high quality peripheral cues in your messaging rather than getting at that central route. And so, question for you. Can you think of an example, some debate that you have heard about, or any issue where people used the peripheral route or central route in order to get their point across? Okay, so what we're going to do now is we are going to focus on Hovland and Weiss's experiment connected with, well, before we get into that, what we're going to talk about for a while. There's a lot on this slide. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to break this down further. I'm not going to stay on this slide. This is going to be expounded on in the next few slides we're going to go over. We're going to talk about how the source of the communication, so who is the persuader, the nature of the communication, what they're saying, and the characteristics of the audience, who they're trying to persuade, all factor into how effective the message is going to be. So, who's doing the talking? 1. Who's doing the listening, and what they're saying is what we're going to go over. First thing we're going to go over is the source of the communication, which starts with credibility. One factor in whether or not you are going to be able to persuade someone is how credible you are as a source, how much people trust your argument. So for the Hovland and Weiss experiment, they had people evaluate a claim that building a nuclear-powered submarine was a feasible undertaking. Yes, the U.S. can have nuclear-powered subs. Some people told that the argument they were reading was written by J. Robert Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer was a famous atomic physicist in the U.S. And the other half of the people thought that the person who wrote the argument was a writer for Pravda, which was a USSR Communist Party newspaper. So did a communist write this thing saying, yes, we should have nuclear subs, or did an American atomic physicist? The people who thought it was Oppenheimer, almost all of them changed their opinion to being pro-nuclear subs. Very few people who read the Pravda piece changed their opinion, because a communist paper during the Cold War is not a credible source. It's not someone we would believe. For example, with the war with Ukraine, If you read a report about how the war is going and it is coming straight from Russian media, you're probably going to take it with a grain of salt because you're American, or you're in the US. We're not pro-Russia in that war. If you were Russian and you saw an article that said it was from the New York Times about the war, you're not going to believe it because you don't trust what's coming out of the US about that war. So is this someone I think is credible? Another component of it is you have to think they're an expert or trustworthy, or if you do, then you're going to trust them more. So not everyone, again, just like with the Pravda versus Oppenheimer, not everyone is equally influenced by the same communicator. So for example, in an experiment done by Aronson and Golden, a person gave kids a speech about the usefulness of math, and half of the time, so it was a 2x2 design, half of the time they thought the person telling them they needed to study hard in math was a prize-winning engineer from a prestigious university. Half of the time they thought it was a dishwasher. And then half of the time, the kids who thought they were talking or hearing a speech from an engineer thought he was black. Half of the time, they thought she was white. So black, white, engineer, dishwasher. And they also measured how racist these little kids were. So they measured how prejudiced they were on a test. If the kids were highly prejudiced, they were less influenced by the black engineer than the white engineer. So in general, you would assume the engineer would be more influential, more persuasive than the dishwasher because it's someone who is an expert in math. But if it was a racist kid hearing a black engineer say you should study hard at math, they weren't persuaded. If they were not prejudiced, then it was actually reversed. They were more influenced by the black engineer than the white engineer. So if you're an expert, if they trust you, that is also going to matter. One way you can build up that trustworthiness is if you argue against your own self-interest. So in this experiment that Walster, Abrahams, and Aronson did, they had people read a newspaper interview with Joe the Shoulder Napolitano, who they thought was a mobster hitman. And that was half the group. The other group thought they were reading a newspaper article from a respected public official. And the newspaper article was about sentences for criminals. So half the time it said we need to be stricter when we sentence criminals, and half of the time it said we need to be more lenient when we are sentencing criminals. And so if they were arguing that sentences should be more lenient, then the public official was somewhat persuasive because that is someone who has credibility, someone who's trustworthy. If it was the shoulder saying we need to go easy on criminals, it had the opposite effect. People's views went more to the extreme for harsher sentencing when it was the shoulder saying let's be nice to criminals. If the person was arguing for stricter sentences, then Joey the shoulder was just as persuasive as the public official because he was arguing against his own self-interests. He would be sentenced more harshly for being a hitman under what he was arguing for. And so because he had nothing to gain for stricter sentences, he was more persuasive in that argument. And then finally, for credibility, if you have indirect influence, it doesn't seem like you are trying to influence someone, then you are going to be more influential. You will be more persuasive. So more trustworthiness is created in situations where people don't think you're trying to persuade them. In this experiment that Walster did, Walster and Festinger, they had two grad students who were talking in a hallway, and one expressed his expert opinion about a topic. Now, this was all a setup. Like, they were Confederates in the study. This was a part of it. An undergrad would overhear these two people talking in the hallway. Half of the time, the undergrad knew that the grad students knew that this undergrad was listening to them in the other room. Half of the time, the undergrad thought that the grad students were not aware that their conversation could be heard. If the participant, the undergrad, thought that the grad students were unaware they were being listened to, then the argument the grad students were making, that expert opinion they were giving, was more persuasive. The participants changed their opinion more. For the next thing, attractiveness and similarity, question for you. Do you think we trust people more if they are unattractive or if they are attractive? We like people and trust people more if we think they are attractive. This is definitely one of those peripheral routes of persuasion. Attractiveness and likability are really powerful. Even if the person does not have expertise or has something to gain by persuading us, we associate the attractiveness of the communicator with the desirability of the message. So we're influenced by people who we think are attractive. Examples of this are celebrity endorsers. That's the whole reason why companies will pay celebrities so much to promote their product, because it's effective. If you like the person, if you think they're cute, you usually don't see unattractive models in ads. You are going to be more persuaded. Again, we also like people, or we're also more persuaded by people if we like them, like a celebrity you think is great, and if we think we're similar to them. So if it's, you'll see this a lot, like with social influencers. The companies who want consumers who are similar to that influencer in some way, their interests, their demographics, whatever, they will pay that influencer, because if you are similar to the influencer, you will like what they're trying to sell you. This only works with trivial things. If it's something that you really care deeply about, then a cute person who's similar to you is not going to persuade you as much. And then the confidence of the communicator. The more confident a person seems in the message they're trying to send, the more trustworthy they seem. And so someone who seems really confident in what they're saying is more persuasive, unless you doubt their motives. If they have too extreme of confidence, then you're going to get suspicious and they will not be able to persuade you. Next, the nature of the communication. So the message they are giving. How communications differ determines how effective they are going to be, how much they're actually going to persuade people. One component of this is similar to that central peripheral aspect. It's that logical versus emotional appeal. Now, most persuasive messages are not exclusively one or the other, not exclusively logical, not exclusively emotional. It's a combination. Most messages are more one than the other, but a combination of both. So it's better to say primarily emotional or primarily logical. A primarily emotional message is more effective than a primarily logical one. So, question connected with this, since we know emotions work well. Would it be more effective to arouse, for an average person, what is more persuasive? a small fear message, so arousing a little bit of fear, or a very scary message, just totally freaking them out. What is more persuasive? All things being equal, the more frightened a person is by a communication, the more likely they are to act, to take preventative actions. So for an average person, more fear is more persuasive. However, there is an exception to this. Self-esteem. So in Leventhal's first experiment I'm going to talk about, they tried to get people to stop smoking and to go get a chest x-ray to, look for tumors. They had a low fear, a moderate fear, and a high fear condition. In the low fear condition, they were given a recommendation to stop smoking and get an x-ray. In the moderate fear condition, they were shown a film of a young man whose x-ray showed lung cancer, and then it was recommended they stop smoking and get an x-ray. And in the high fear condition, they saw that same film about the guy finding out he had cancer, and then they saw another really gory film about lung cancer surgery, and then it was recommended they stop smoking and get an x-ray. The more frightened they were, the more eager they were to stop smoking, and the more likely they were to get an x-ray. So the high fear group was most likely to go get the x-ray. People who had higher opinions of themselves, people who had higher self-esteem, were more likely to be motivated to take immediate action when they were frightened. So especially for the higher self-esteem people. But people who had low self-esteem were less likely to take action if they were in the high fear group. If they knew they could take action later, then they behaved like the high self-esteem people. But if it was like, we're really going to scare you, you have to go right now and get the x-ray, nope, they were not going to act. You could not persuade them if they had low self-esteem. So why is this? The reason the low self-esteem people had the opposite effect for the high fear group with the immediate action is because they couldn't cope with that threat. They had a low self-esteem, a low opinion of themselves. In their minds, they are not capable of dealing with this really scary thing. They just wanted to go hide under a blanket somewhere. So they didn't feel they were up to the challenge of this very scary thing if they had low self-esteem. You had to give them time so they could acclimate in order to get them to act. So high fear does not work as well for low self-esteem people. For the other Leventhal experiment, they had people watch a car accident, and half of the time they were up close with a big screen to watch this accident, and then half of the time it was far away and it was a small screen. If they had moderate or high self-esteem, the large screen, the up-close large screen film made them more likely to take protective action, like start wearing their seatbelt all the time and not speed. If they had low self-esteem, it was the opposite. They were more likely to act if it was the small screen far away, if they were in the low fear group. So keep that in mind. Self-esteem affects that fear persuasiveness correlation. Another factor with this is specific instructions, whether you give specific instructions with the fear message. For people who have low self-esteem to act, you have to give a message with specific optimistic instructions so they think that they actually can do something to confront their fears. So in an experiment connected with this, they urged college students to get a tetanus shot. And they had two groups. One was the instruction-only group. For the instruction-only group, they were told, here is where you go and get a tetanus shot. For the fear group, it was, here are all the bad things that can happen from tetanus. This is what lockjaw does. And then here's the instructions on how to go get a tetanus shot. If all they got was instructions, 3% went and got the shot. If it was the fear group with the instructions, then it was 28% who went and got the shot. So fear plus instructions works well to get people to act. And then finally for fear, if it's an immediate threat versus a distant threat, that also plays a part. So for example, why are people not working really hard to fight climate change right now? Like, why can you still find plastic bags everywhere in the US, and why are people still driving gas-guzzling cars? Because it's not an immediate threat. Like, you're not gonna die today from climate change. It's something that's gonna happen in the future. And so Dan Gilbert says that we've evolved to be frightened by threats that are clear and present dangers, not gradual ones that might affect us in the future, or, you know, might affect our kids or our grandkids in the future. It's what is going to hurt us today. So we've evolved to respond to intentional threats as well, like terrorism. If it's intentional, if it's immediate, that is what's most likely to get us to act. So McGlone, in his research done in 2009, this was during the swine flu pandemic, which was a big deal at the time. Did not kill nearly as many people as COVID, but it was a big deal in 2009. So there was this vaccine, the swine flu vaccine, that you had to get different than the normal flu. And so they were trying to get as many Americans as possible vaccinated. I remember I was working at a college in Massachusetts, and they lined us all up in the student center so we could all get our swine flu vaccine. So for this experiment, they handed out one of 2 pamphlets to people to try to convince them to get the swine flu vaccine. Half of the time it said thousands of people may die from swine flu this year. The other half of the time it said swine flu may kill thousands of people this year. Technically, those are the same thing. But kill is more intentional than may die from. And so more people scheduled their flu shot if they got that pamphlet that said swine flu may kill thousands of people this year. That intentionality made it more persuasive. And so, you know what, I'm gonna keep going. This video will be slightly longer. I'm going to, actually, you know what, so this one is not too long. I'm gonna stop this one here now. I'm gonna finish up talking about the nature of the communication in the next video, and then talk about the nature of the audience as well in the next one.